150 years ago, Karl Marx published his Capital. In the eyes of bourgeois thinkers and of the academic and media mainstream, Marx is completely outdated today. They might ask, where are the proletarians in rags? Today, we have to admit, we live in a world of democracy and the free market. On the other hand, traditional leftists might object that capitalism has returned, especially in its neoliberal form, that there is once again a huge gap between the rich and the poor, and there are other kinds of subaltern and oppressed people. I will argue that there is another way of assessing the topical importance of Marx's theory today. In 150 years, the surface of capitalism has indeed changed a lot. But its core is still the same, only its outward manifestations have changed. The core is what Marx analyzed, especially in the first chapter of Capital, but also in other parts of his critical of political economy, like the Grundrisse. Commodity and value, money and abstract labor are these main categories. To avoid any misunderstanding and conflating between abstract labor and immaterial labor, as often happens today, it is better to speak clearly, as Marx does, about the abstract side of labor. It's the twofold nature of labor. Marx himself, and this is interesting, deemed his analysis of the twofold nature of labor, that means that each labor is abstract and concrete in capitalist conditions of productions, he deemed this analysis to be his most important discovery, more than class theory. What does it mean? Each instance of labor, but only under capitalist conditions, since there is nothing natural in the twofold nature of labor, each labor is both abstract and concrete at the same time. As concrete labor, each activity produces goods or services, but the same activity, be it on a computer or be it agriculture work, is also a simpler expenditure of human energy measured in time, is a poor quantity of time without regard to what has been done in that time. The concrete side of labor corresponds to the use value, and the abstract side corresponds to the value, or marchand value, represented by money of the same commodity. In capitalism, the abstract side of labor and of its products prevails over the concrete side. And this is even the most profound root of the absurdity of the capitalist mode of production. These are the underlying fundamental structures of every form of capitalism, including its state-run versions, which have been abusively called socialist or communist. But these structures are neither neutral nor natural. They are historically specific to capitalism, and they are destructive and self-destructive. That means also that this is not a matter of trying to use them in a better socialist, communist, anarchist, etc. way, but to overcome and to abolish them. And this is possible in principle, at least, since humanity lived for a long time without these categories. If you object that there was money, work, etc. in other pre-capitalist societies, we have to say that they had a very different social function and not much in common with what we call today money, work, etc. Historians which are not necessarily Marxists confirm it, like Jacques Le Goff for the Middle Age or Moses Finlay for Antiquity. The reign of the commodity and value, money and abstract labor, has its most typical and mysterious manifestation in what Marx calls commodity fetishism. It is not just an exaggerated appreciation of commodities, as when we speak maybe about a fetishist of cars or something like that, as occurs typically in consumer society. And it is not only a mystification of the real nature of bourgeois exploitation and domination, a wheel which does hide the origin of surplus value. That's how traditional Marxists interpret the concept of commodity fetishism, that this is only a part of the meaning of this concept. It means something more general. For it means essentially a system where what Marx calls the automatic subject reigns supreme, where humans are the servants of the economy they create, and which appears to them as an independent force. Commodity fetishism is a principal form of capitalist social mediation. Concrete activities and objects, let's say concrete labor and use values, even if these terms can pose some problem, serve only to embody to the underlying real essence, abstract essence of the commodity society. And this real essence is the value created by the abstract side of labor without any consideration of its content. The capitalists themselves are just the executors of this anonymous systemic logic. They don't control it. A subordination of the concrete to the abstract, an inversion of the relationship between them and its dynamic, destructive character are the most distinctive features of capitalist societies as compared to other historical forms of society. It is not necessary to take Marx literally, nor to defend something like a sacred text when we assert his ongoing importance in order to understand the world of today. What matters is to put to work, as to say, his central categories of the critique of political economy. And this has been done in the last decades by the American author Moshe Postone, the author of Time, Labor and Social Domination, published in 1993, and has been done by the German Wertkritik, which has been developed especially by Robert Kurz and by the reviews Krisis and Exit, which he founded. A critic which has some partial forerunners in the young Lukács, naturally in History and Class Consciousness, in Isaac Rubin and his book about the value theory of 1924. Freddie Perlman, an American who published an important introduction to the first English translation of Rubin's book in 1969. Also some important ideas have been developed by the Frankfurt School, especially by Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse, and by the situationists, especially by Guy Debord. So, to take up again Marx's most revolutionary concepts means to go against nearly everything that traditional Marxism has argued in favor of for the last 150 years. It also means sometimes to go against some of Marx's own theories. So it is not necessary to assert that Marx was always right. This is especially true for the concept of class struggle. And it is also true for its substitutes like race or gender issues. These struggles exist naturally and they can be very important. But they are not automatically emancipatory or anti-capitalist. During the last 150 years, they helped often to integrate first the workers and then other subaltern classes into the system. There was nearly no more contestation of the very fact that social life is devoted to the multiplication of abstract value by the means of labor. It was only a more equal distribution of these categories that was demanded, for example, by trade workers' unions. All the changes which have occurred since Marx's time on the surface of capitalism did not change its internal structure and its inner contradictions. Now capitalism faces not so much its declared adversaries, that's to say some kind of revolutionaries, but faces the limits created by its own development. These limits accompanied it from the beginning, but have passed a certain level and became visible in the 1970s. On the one hand, an inner limit. Value is created only by living labor, but competition pushes capital to use labor-saving technology whenever possible. Finally, all technological inventions are always inventions which aim at saving labor and produce much more things with less labor. However, if less labor is used in the production of the commodity, it also means that the commodity has less value, since living labor is the only source of value, as Marx shows. Technologies do not produce value. They can only transmit a value already created. Less value means that less surplus value and finally less profit is realized. Only a continuous augmentation of production is able to forestall this tendency of the value mass to diminish, not only the rate of profit, as traditional Marxists often said, but also of the whole mass of value and surplus value. Less value means that less surplus value and finally less profit is realized. Only a continuous augmentation of production is able to forestall this tendency, the value to diminish. The less value is contained in every single commodity, for example in a car whose costs have diminished constantly during the 20th century. The more the output of commodities, their number has to augment in order that the mass surplus value does not fall. This can be called a compensation process. But in the last 40 years, the rationalization processes, that means the replacing of living labor with technologies, have moved at a much faster pace than the compensation processes. Use of living, capital-producing labor is globally shrinking, and so does the absolute mass of value, and ultimately the mass of profit also. Real profitability is largely replaced by simulation, especially in the financial sphere. The growth of the global finance of what Marx called fictitious capital was a response to the growing lack of real profitability. One of the consequences is that work has less and less jobs to offer, and finally the whole social order based on labor is falling gradually into pieces. The other great limit, the external one, is the ecological one, the exhaustion of natural resources. The accumulation of value and capital is an accumulation of abstract wealth which has no limits, since it aims at nothing concrete but only at abstract quantity. But abstract value has to realize, to materialize itself in something concrete, and at least partly in something material, since production cannot be limited to services or communication, as somebody wants to make us believe today by speaking about a service society or about cognitive capitalism. That's why the logic of value leads inevitably to the ravaging of natural resources. The ecological disaster is quite evident and is much discussed, but without a reference to the logic of value production, as analyzed by Marx in Capital, there can be no real understanding of the causes and eventual remedies to the ecological disaster. We can even say that Marx's theory of money and value, commodity and twofold labor, fetishism and the automatic subject is more relevant today than ever, since the effects are more evident in a pure capitalistic society than in the half-feudal society to which Marx still belonged. Furthermore, our understanding of contemporary psychic structures, in particular narcissism, depression, and acts of blind destruction, remains fragmentary and superficial without reference to the subjective side of the fetishistic logic of value. Indeed, that logic goes far beyond the purely economic aspect of social life. 100 years and 2 months exactly after Capital, after the publication of Capital, Guy Debord, the leader of the Situationist International, founded 10 years before, published in Paris in 1967 The Society of Spectacle. Its first phrase read, "The wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles." This phrase is identical to the first phrase of Capital, with the only difference that Debord writes accumulation of spectacles, where Marx wrote accumulation of commodities. The tone was given with this détournement, as the Situationists call the reuse and improvement of existing cultural material. Debord presented, without declaring it openly, that to write in kind of new capital, to modernize and adapt Marx's analysis to the present, he pretended to write what Marx might have written 100 years after Capital, if he was still there. He uses Marx, and especially Marx's theory of the commodity, which Debord reads mainly through the lenses of Lukács' history and class consciousness, as the basis of his own theory, but he puts the spectacle in the place of commodity. So we can understand immediately that Debord's spectacle means much more than a critique of the media, to which it has so often been reduced. The spectacle is for Debord the contemporary development of the commodity form and obeys the same logic. Debord's main work belongs clearly to the field of Marxist theory, a fact that is today often ignored or hushed up, in order to place Debord only in the artistic and literary field, or to reduce him to a media theorist. Debord transformed Marx's categories, which had been turned into an object of erudite debates, into living ones by combining them with observations about the new consumer society. Debord contributed greatly to our awareness of the necessity of a radical break with the basic categories of capitalism, and not only with some of its specific forms. He also helped to move the focus of critical analysis and praxis. What matters is not only the economic sphere of and labor, but also everyday life and issues like urbanism and housing. It was the changing reality itself which brought to the forefront the hidden core of Marx's theory, the criticism of value and the commodity, abstract labor and money. When capitalism entered its phase of decline, there was no longer any possibility for a better distribution of its wealth, and the question of overcoming the system appeared. The abandonment of the Keynesian class compromise after the 1970s was not only due to political circumstances or to a class war from above, but was due essentially to the internal dynamics of capitalist accumulation and its historical development. The substitution of human labor with technologies, which create more economic value, as I recall. Through value production into crisis and stimulated the simulation of accumulations by the means of credit and finance. There is no possibility to revoke this evolution and to return to a reasonable capitalism. In its declining phase, capitalism has no longer the possibility to offer some supplementary gratifications to the majority of the population as in its heyday. The question today is not to take power or to get more economic justice or to combine ecological reasons and economic growth or something like that, but to invent forms of life beyond the logic of commodity and labor. However, what happens today is quite the opposite. The decline of capitalism calls forth the worst demons. The crisis of capitalism is not at all identical with the rise of emancipatory solutions and forces, as revolutionaries have nearly always believed. Capitalism had 250 years to colonize all aspects and sectors of life, and often has left only burnt land behind it, destroying all other forms of life. on all levels. Literally and metaphorically, it was burnt land, externally and internally. Capitalism has by no means prepared the terrain for socialism. Its development of productive forces did not create the material presuppositions of a higher form of life, as was believed so long by traditional Marxists. Capitalism never had a civilizing mission, as even Marx occasionally argued. If somebody did understand this destructive aspect of capitalism in that time even better than Marx itself, I think this was William Morris. Capitalism is not only unjust and ugly, it also does not work anymore. One of its most striking aspects is that every growing masses of people, entire social groups, regions, countries and continents are becoming superfluous for the cycle of accumulation and therefore also for consumption. The labor force is not needed anymore, and so they have no longer a reason, they have no longer the right to exist in the eyes, as to say, of the logic of value. The sufferings that stem from the classical problem of exploitation naturally continue existing, but they are also partially replaced by the sufferings that derive from being superfluous and useless, as people are not even worthwhile exploiting, and potentially everybody is under this threat nowadays. This situation is difficult to explain in the classical class struggle-centered approach, but becomes much more understandable if we go back to Marx's commodity analysis and if we consider the destructive force of the logic of abstract labor. The responses to the barbarization of capitalism can be equally barbarian. That's what we have been seeing in recent years. I think that the problem is not so much a return of fascism. Naturally, there are many powerful neo-fascist movements, for example in France, and other phenomena which recalls fascism, such as Donald Trump. But capitalism is not always the return of the same, and to identify today's phenomena with those of the past can be an obstacle for understanding the real dangers of today. One of these new dangers is what I would call transversal populism, which is based on a fake anticapitalism. I say transversal since this new populism often mingles left-wing and right-wing arguments directed against the surface of capitalist society, and most of all against one of its aspects: finance, speculation, credit, banks. These perspectives do not explain the evils of capitalism by referring to the production process, but the very existence of labor and money, and they do not even refer to class structures and exploitation as traditional Marxists did. Rather, they refer to what we call the parasites located in the financial sphere and to corrupt politicians. Some of these movements pretend to be left-wing, like Occupy Wall Street or Podemos in Spain. Many are openly right-wing, and some, like the Italian Cinque Stelle, five stars, are maybe the future of populism, since they take elements from both. The anti-capitalist rhetoric of these movements should not deceive, and does not constitute something like a half-truth. Nazism and other historical fascist movements also proclaim themselves to be against the plutocracies, as they call it, and they oppose the good, the creative capital, allied with labor, against the bad, the greedy financial capital identified with the Jews. The consequences of this are well known. This unilateral critic of monetary interest and distribution, which avoids every critic of the capitalist mode of production, and especially of labor, has a long tradition. It is also which goes partly back at least to Jean-Pierre Proudhon in the 19th century, but is also very present inside of traditional Marxism itself. It valorizes the so-called concrete, that in reality is a pseudo-concrete, like race, people or state, is opposed to the threatening force of the abstraction, that means the value, whose effects are perceived, for example, by losing one's job due to economical globalization, but are not fully understood. The populist movement in all their versions helped the system survive by channeling the rage of its victims into a completely wrong direction. However, the problem is not only seduction and manipulation by the media. If we would limit the use of the concept of spectacle to the media sphere, we would still suppose a unilateral relation between political and economic power on the one hand and the masses on the other. If you refer to concepts like manipulation also. But if you remember that the spectacle which Debord is talking about means the transformation of all desires and needs into commodities, and means a structural separation between actors and spectators, reducing life to a passive contemplation, we will find that the spectacle has profoundly reshaped the subjects themselves and their psychic structure. As Debord says in his commentaries about the Society of Spectacle published in 1988, the spectacle has succeeded in raising a generation which has never known anything other than the spectacle. And he wrote that several years before the unleashing of the digital and virtual culture, which seems to have rooted industrial capitalism and abstract logic more than ever in our heads.